In today's episode, we've got Canadian Lions, Old York, your very, very great-grandfather, the Bug River, tambourines, the Firstborn Coalition, and an extra-long intro for an extra-long episode. It's time for your Jewish Week. Hey everyone, welcome to a special extended episode of Your Jewish Week, the podcast for everything Jewish in the week ahead. I'm Rabbi Dovey. As always, this podcast is produced by Chabad.org and dedicated to all our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May Hashem keep them safe from all harm, and may all the hostages finally be freed to return to their families and loved ones. Today is Sunday, the 8th of Nisan, and if you happen to find yourself in Rhyolite, Nevada, home of the famous Tom Kelly Bottle House, you'll find Shabbat candlelighting this week coming in at 7:01 p.m. If you're not going to be there, good choice. It's been abandoned for over 100 years, and although the well-preserved buildings has served as the backdrop for many a Western film shoot, it's still a downright creepy ghost town and no place to spend Shabbat. Better find someplace with less dust and more air conditioning. And once you're there, check out Chabad.org/times to find out halachic times for your location of choice. Starting us off, as always, with the weekly Parsha, this week's Torah portion is Parshas Tzav. We're picking up right where we left off last week, describing various sacrifices and the procedures for offering them. Sunday, we'll go over the removal of the ashes from the altar and a couple more details about the mincha flour offering, which we covered last week. Monday, it's more of the same, repeating the laws of the sin and guilt offerings from last week with a few added details, plus some miscellaneous laws of sacrificial meat. Tuesday, we'll introduce the Toda offering, which is brought as a thanksgiving after surviving various dangers, and we'll wrap up the laws of sacrifices by covering several factors that can disqualify an offering. Starting Wednesday and continuing the rest of the week, it's back to narrative mode as the Torah gives us a detailed account of the Mishkan's inauguration process. We'll see Moshe dress Aaron and his sons in their priestly uniforms, anoint them and the entire Mishkan with holy oil, and offer several inaugural sacrifices. Parshas Tzav contains 97 verses, with the memory key being, get this, the name Tzav. What bothers me about that is that Tzav does not, in fact, add up to 97, it adds up to 96, so I'm frankly not sure what's going on with that. I guess you could say it's Tzav plus 1. As always, check out the link in the show notes for more insight into the meaning behind this week's key. In the Daily Tanya, we're smack in middle of a discussion that, to be honest, doesn't really break up neatly into individual weeks, which makes my job harder. It all started a couple weeks ago when the Alter Rebbe set out to explain the purpose of a Beinoni's constant struggle with his animal soul. That led us into a more general discussion on the nature of physical versus spiritual, or in terms of our service of God, the action versus the intention, or in Hebrew, the kavanah. Now, on that topic, we got into a bit of a tangent exploring the various categories and levels of kavanah. Basically, depending on the kind of soul you have, you can attain a higher level of kavanah. I know that's frustratingly simplistic, but it's pretty much all I could fit into this podcast. My aim was to get you frustrated enough that you'd go and crack open a Tanya yourself, just to teach me a lesson. Be that as it may, we're going to stick with that tangent up until Tuesday when we'll start to bring it back around, kind of. The Alter Rebbe is going to walk us through different ways a person could do mitzvot, different levels of emotional commitment. You could do a mitzvah, for example, with full, passionate love and fear of Hashem, or you could do it out of habit, or even for a negative ulterior motive, like for people to look up to you. What you achieve with your Torah learning and your mitzvot depends on your intention and your level of involvement. And that's pretty much what we'll be exploring straight through to the end of the week, the different grades of divine service and the spiritual achievements you attain with each one. In the weekly Rambam Youth 3 chapter and Sefer HaMitzvos learners will be wrapping up the order of prayer on Sunday before beginning a whole new book of Rambam and a new set of laws, the laws of Shabbat. You'll start off with defining some terms and general principles of Shabbat observance on Sunday, then moving on to the laws of Shabbat preparations on Monday. Tuesday, we'll wrap up the pre-Shabbat laws and start discussing the 39 categories of forbidden labor which form the basis for all the prohibitions of Shabbat. We'll start with the labors that are part of the food preparation process, like harvesting and baking. Then we'll move on to fabricating and maintaining clothing, slaughtering and preparing animal hides for leather, creating fire, and carrying. Now, carrying in particular requires a whole slew of background information. So from Thursday to Shabbat, we'll be defining the different domains when it comes to carrying and other relevant metrics. In the one-chapter track, you'll continue your deep dive into the riveting world of ritualariums, also known as mikvahs. You'll learn about substances that create a chatzitza, an interruption between the person or object and the water, which invalidates the immersion. And you'll learn what kinds of water can and cannot be used for a mikvah. As always, if you'd like to learn more about anything you just heard, or if you're ready to join one of the daily study cycles, check out the show notes for links and resources. All right, with the weekly overview done, it's time to take it day by day. Now, we're going to be doing it a bit differently this week. Being that Shabbat takes us right into the first days of Pesach, we'll cover Sunday all the way through to next Monday, with next week's episode picking up on Tuesday, the first day of Chol HaMoed. First off, a general reminder that all throughout this week we'll be saying the daily Nasi and skipping the Tachnun portion of our prayers. We covered both of those last week. In Jewish history, Sunday, the 8th of Nisan, was the final day of the 180-day-long feast thrown by King Achashverosh in the year 366 BCE. You're probably familiar with this feast. It was famously the event that kicked off the story of Purim, and it's recounted at the very beginning of the Megillah. What you might not be familiar with is the reason for this feast. When the first Holy Temple was destroyed and the Jews were exiled from the Holy Land, Hashem promised to end the Babylonian exile and bring the Jews back after 70 years. Now, this prophecy made all the subsequent Babylonian and later Persian kings nervous, because there was a good chance that the exile ending for the Jews would mean something unpleasant happening to them, such as death, or maybe torture and then death, which is still as bad. Arguably, it's even worse. Well, Achashverosh had done some math, and by his calculation, the 70 years ended in the third year of his reign, and of course nothing happened. He thus concluded that the Jews were down and out for good this time, and he threw a massive party to celebrate that. At the party, he exhibited looted vessels from the Holy Temple as a kind of trophy. Well, unlikely as it sounds, it turns out that Achashverosh and I share at least one thing in common. We're both terrible at math. The 70 years were not, in fact, over, and the Holy Temple would later be rebuilt under the rule of Achashverosh's son, King Darius. Moving forward about 1,000 years or so, if you live in New York, as I did until recently, you may occasionally find yourself wondering, why? Why this whole city? Why do we need New York? I mean, what was wrong with the old one? Did it really need to be replaced? And is this one actually better? And the answer to all those questions is, of course, a resounding yes. Turns out the old York was severely messed up, and as many problems as there are with the new one, it's still an improvement. Here's the story. In 1190, the entire Jewish population of York, the old York, was brutally murdered in unspeakable ways by a mob of local Christians. The details of the massacre aren't for this podcast, but it was so uniquely macabre that it reportedly led to the rabbinic authorities of the day issuing a cherem, a ban of ostracism, on the whole town. Basically, to this day, a Jew is forbidden to spend the night in the city of York. You can visit it, but you can't stay there. Now, I haven't been able to find a reputable source for this ban, but I've heard it in several places. And regardless, the massacre was indeed ghastly in the extreme. So for all its parking tickets and potholes and questionable pizza joints, I'll still take the New York. Tuesday, the 10th of Nisan, marks the yahrzeit of Miriam, the sister of Moshe Rabbeinu in the year 1274 BCE. Miriam first appears in the Torah as an assistant to her mother Yocheved. The two of them were commanded by Paro to murder Jewish baby boys moments after their birth, but with great courage they defied the cruel decree. In fact, they redoubled their efforts to help mothers and newborns. But perhaps most memorably, Miriam was the one who led the women in joyful song and dance following the splitting of the sea. The Torah specifies that she and the other women pulled out their tambourines and used them to punctuate their Thanksgiving song. Now, it wasn't like everyone routinely carried tambourines in case of spontaneous dance parties. These women, led by Miriam, had been so certain of Hashem's salvation that they literally got some tambourines and had them ready to celebrate at any moment. Even during the dark, uncertain days in Egypt, the women expressed their pure faith physically with literal objects that served as a reminder and symbol of the coming redemption. This is one of the reasons that the Talmud attributes the redemption from Egypt to the faith of the righteous women. And in our times, as we look towards the final redemption with Mashiach, the Rebbe has called upon Jewish women to lead the way once again. Many women responded to the Rebbe's call by following Miriam's example, literally getting tambourines, decorating them, and keeping them handy in their homes ready to greet Mashiach at any moment. The Rebbe responded approvingly to this initiative, and you can see it in many Chabad homes. We've got one in our house as well. Moving on to Wednesday, the 11th of Nisan, we've got a couple things. Let's take it in chronological order. In 1273 BCE, the Jewish people circumcised themselves en masse. Is that how you pronounce it? En masse, following their crossing of the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. Circumcision had been put on pause during the 40 years in the desert due to adverse health conditions, but now, on their first day in the Promised Land, the Jewish people reaffirmed their bond with Hashem by entering themselves and their sons into his covenant. Much more recently, the 11th of Nisan is the birthday of our Rebbe. The Rebbe was born in 1902 in the city of Nikolaev, Ukraine, which is a city that every Lubavitcher knows but most likely couldn't find on a map, because the only thing we know about it is that the Rebbe was born there. I mean, I personally also happen to know that it sits on the bank of the Bug River because that's hilarious, and I have a long-standing personal philosophy of finding out things that are hilarious. I mean, come on, Bug River? What in the world? Was there nothing more noteworthy about the river than the bugs? Either way, getting back to the subject, the Rebbe grew up surrounded by respected Torah authorities. His father, I believe Yitzchak Schneerson, served as the chief rabbi of Yekaterinoslav, and his maternal grandmother, Meir Shlomo Yanofsky, was the rabbi of Nikolaev. This brought the Rebbe into contact with many prominent thinkers and rabbis from a very young age. By all accounts, they were all astounded by his knowledge and insight, even from earliest childhood. In more modern times, the 11th of Nisan gave rise to a unique tradition, presenting gifts to the Rebbe. At the yearly Farbrengen held to mark the day, dignitaries, statesmen, and public figures would come up between the Rebbe's talks to offer him gifts of all kinds, like keys to various cities, formal proclamations of congratulation from the President of the United States and others, that kind of thing. In 1978, Congress asked then-President Jimmy Carter to declare the 11th of Nisan as Education and Sharing Day USA, in recognition of the Rebbe's contributions to education. It has since become a yearly tradition on both the state and federal level, with every subsequent president issuing a proclamation recognizing the Rebbe's role in reshaping society for the better. Dozens of states and hundreds of more localized governing bodies have done the same, with more and more joining every single year. Now, that's all obviously very nice, but what the Rebbe actually asked for outright on a number of occasions are gifts of a more spiritual kind, resolutions to improve our relationship with Hashem in some way, to take on an additional mitzvah or learn some more Torah. Often, school children and yeshiva students would work for months to memorize swaths of the Mishnah or Tanya by heart. In 1989, for example, a large number of young children passed by the Rebbe to present their gift. Every single one of them had learned the entire order of Moed, one of the 6 orders of the Mishnah, by heart. If you're not familiar with the Mishnah, that's a big deal. It's a very big deal. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a very good chance you owe a lot to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Probably a whole lot. The entire landscape of Jewish life in the modern era has been and continues to be transformed by the Rebbe's initiatives. This Wednesday, consider pushing yourself a little out of your comfort zone in honor of the Rebbe's birthday and taking your Jewishness to the next level, because frankly, I think we can agree the Rebbe deserves it. Thursday, the 12th of Nisan, we get our first Pesach-related landmark, the Fast of the Firstborn. Because Pesach begins on a Saturday night, the day before Pesach is Shabbat, and that means that many of the practices that are usually done the day before Pesach have to be bumped back. The first of these customs is the Fast of the Firstborn. As the name suggests, firstborns, like myself, observe a fast on the day before Pesach in commemoration of being spared during the final plague in Egypt. If the firstborn child is under bar mitzvah age, his father fasts for him. Except he doesn't, because the custom is to consistently find an excuse not to observe the fast by attending a meal marking the fulfillment of a mitzvah. That could be a bris, for example, but typically it's a siyum, a party marking the completion of a significant portion of the Torah, like a tractate of Talmud. Another pre-Pesach observance that gets pushed back to Thursday is the search for the chametz. On Pesach, we are forbidden to eat, see, or even own anything made of grain that has been allowed to rise. That's what we refer to as chametz. In the days and weeks before Pesach, we thoroughly clean our house of all traces of chametz. Alternatively, we move in with our in-laws for Pesach. On the night before Pesach, or in this case on Thursday night, we wrap 10 pieces of chametz well to prevent crumbs and then hide them throughout the house. Then we say a special blessing and search the house for the 10 pieces along with any other bits of chametz that may still remain. We traditionally use a feather, a spoon, and a candle for the search, and after conducting it, we formally proclaim any chametz we haven't found to be ownerless like the dust of the earth. Check out the link in the show notes for explanations on that, as well as a detailed how-to. Moving on to Friday, the 13th of Nisan, we take the 10 pieces of chametz that we collected the night before and we burn them, along with any other chametz that remains in our possession. You can find all applicable laws and text in the same link as before. Now, typically, this would be done on the day before Pesach, which would mean you've got a deadline. Now, that's not the case this year, but we still do our best to burn the chametz at the right time to avoid potentially getting mixed up on a regular year. And if you have chametz you don't want to burn, it's important to sell it. You can find the link to do that in the show notes as well. And just on a practical note, you've got to set aside some bread for the Shabbat meal the following day, but make sure not to leave too much. After all, you've got to get rid of it all before the deadline, which we'll talk about in a minute. In Jewish history, the 13th of Nisan is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, the third Rebbe of Chabad, also known as the Tzemach Tzedek, after one of the many works he authored. The Tzemach Tzedek was raised by his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, and took on the mantle of leadership after the passing of his uncle and father-in-law, Reb Dov Ber Shneur, the second Rebbe of Chabad, known as the Mittler Rebbe. Well before then, even as a young teenager, the Tzemach Tzedek had already begun writing towering works of Torah scholarship, including a book detailing the philosophical and Kabbalistic root of many mitzvot. It's called Derech Mitzvosecha. I had some good times with that one back in yeshiva. There's so much more to say about the Tzemach Tzedek that doesn't fit in here, so check out the link in the show notes for a longer biography. That brings us to Shabbat, the 14th of Nisan, the day before Pesach. This Shabbat is known as Shabbat HaGadol, the Great Shabbat, in reference to a great miracle that took place right before the 10th plague in Egypt. Basically, Moshe told the Jewish people to prepare a lamb for the Pesach offering and use its blood to insulate themselves from the coming death of the firstborn. Now, 600,000 families getting ready for an epic national barbecue is the kind of thing that people find newsworthy, and it wasn't long before the word of the plague started to spread to everyone, including the Egyptian firstborns. At this point, after 9 plagues, Moshe's threats had some serious credibility, and the firstborns found themselves getting distinctly uncomfortable with the idea of impending sudden death from above. Pretty understandable. So they went to Paro and they told him, dude, this is real. You gotta let the Jews go. We can't have a major segment of our population just dropping dead, particularly when that segment is us. And Pharaoh said no, because at that point he was literally incapable of saying yes. Hashem had suspended his power of free will as part of his punishment for his earlier misdeeds. With no other choice, the coalition of firstborns attempted a coup to overthrow Paro and the ruling elite. As you can probably guess, they lost, but there were heavy casualties on both sides. This miracle is one of the greatest of the Exodus story because it uniquely featured the Jews' oppressors themselves fighting for their redemption, albeit indirectly. Now, this took place on the Shabbat before the Exodus, which that year was the 10th of Nisan. But instead of commemorating it on the date, we commemorate it on the day of the week, the Shabbat before Pesach, whichever date it falls out on. This year is the 14th. Now, this is weird, because generally Jewish holidays are celebrated based on the day of the month, not the day of the week. There's a beautiful explanation from the Rebbe as to why that is, which sadly didn't fit into this already oversized episode, so I'll attach a link to an English translation of it in the show notes. Go check it out, it's worth your while. Now, something very important to remember this Shabbat is the deadline for eating chametz. It's generally in the late morning, like between 10 and 11, depending where you are. So it's really important to hop on to Chabad.org/times, find out when the chametz deadline is in your area, and finish eating chametz before then. As a matter of practicality, this usually means praying a bit earlier in the day so you can eat your chametz Shabbat meal well before the cutoff time. If you've got crumbs left over after that, the best thing to do is actually to flush them down the toilet. Throwing them in the trash alone is not enough. After getting rid of our final chametz for the next 8 days, we recite the official proclamation of nullification, which you can find in the show notes. In the afternoon, we've got a special addition to our mincha prayer. We recite portions of the Haggadah, specifically from the Maggid section recounting the story of our enslavement and redemption. It's also customary for the rabbi of the town to give a Shabbat HaGadol speech, basically briefing the community on the laws of Pesach. In the times of the Holy Temple, the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan was the time when all Jews would converge on the Holy Temple to offer their yearly Pesach sacrifice. During exile, the custom has arisen to read a detailed account of the sacrifice procedure, including the very cool system they would use to make sure every single Jew had a chance to offer a sacrifice during this narrow time slot. You could find that in most prayer books, and again, we'll be reading that Shabbat afternoon. As Shabbat comes to an end, we head into Pesach, one of the most prominent holidays of the year. We light the holiday candles after Shabbat ends, so make sure to find out the time for that, and make sure to verbally signal the end of Shabbat by saying Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. Blessed is he who separates between holy and mundane. And of course, we'll be holding our first Pesach Seder on Saturday night, with another one coming on Sunday night. The Seder is ostensibly a meal, but it's really so much more than that. Throughout the 15 steps, we don't just tell the story of Pesach, we experience it on a deeply sensory level. We taste the bitterness of the maror, we see and feel the mortar-like charoses, and we physically display our freedom by luxuriantly leaning in our seats and drinking generous and often purgative amounts of wine. Every detail of the Seder is crafted by age-old tradition into this multi-sensory production with an extremely well-defined target audience, the children. There's a reason pretty much all Jews have at least a basic knowledge of the Seder. The customs of the Seder were made unusual on purpose in order to stimulate the children's curiosity and interest. They're encouraged to ask questions and participate in the conversation about the Exodus. The famous 4 questions, for example, are asked by the children, starting with the youngest. As we approach Pesach, think about what you can do to make the Seder special for you. If you haven't already, consider joining your family or a local Chabad and celebrating together. Or if you'll be leading the Seder in your own home, you can find all sorts of resources in the show notes, including a step-by-step guide and a complete Haggadah. All right, moving on to Sunday, the first day of Pesach. As with Sukkot, the first 2 days of Pesach are Yom Tov, meaning they're treated fully as a holiday, while the middle 4 days are called Chol HaMoed, the kind of semi-weekdays, still holy but with a few less restrictions. We'll get to that next week, but for now, the first 2 days are treated more or less like Shabbat, with all the prohibitions in place, with 2 notable exceptions. Firstly, you can cook and perform associated actions like transferring fire but not lighting it. It's important to note that electricity is still off limits and that this leniency only applies to food that is necessary for the holiday itself. You can't prepare for the next day. And secondly, you can carry outside when necessary. As with all 8 days of Pesach, we insert special holiday additions to our prayers, along with holiday Torah readings, and make a special Kiddush at the start of our meal. In Musaf, the additional morning prayer, we make a change that is sure to mess with your brain. We switch from Mashiv Haruach Umorid HaGeshem to Morid HaTal in the second blessing of the Amidah. At the same time, we also switch to V'sein Bracha in the weekday Amidah. The first instance of that is going to be the Ma'ariv prayer on Monday night. Now, this is a really trippy experience because if you pray 3 times a day, as you should, you are very used to saying Mashiv Haruach and will most likely make a mistake at some point. That's why it might be a good idea to crack open Chapter 20 of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abridged code of Jewish law, and review the laws to find out what to do if you mess up. Also, if you use the translated or annotated siddur that are popular in Chabad houses, that's the blue one or the brown one, you've got a handy cheat sheet for that actually on page 589 in the bottom, so you could always refer to that. Now, just my luck, the first day of Pesach also happens to be a packed day in Jewish history as well. Now, I have no time to give each event the treatment it deserves, so to borrow a term from the online gaming community, I'm just going to speedrun it. Ahem. On the 15th of Nisan in the year 1743 BCE, our forefather Avraham experienced the Bris Bein HaBesarim, in which God promised to give the land of Canaan to his descendants. It involved lots of animals chopped in half. Check out Genesis chapter 15 for that. Several years later, Avraham battled the 4 kings on this same date. Basically, they did bad stuff and kidnapped his nephew, so he whooped them and got nephew back, pretty much by himself. Couple years after that, Avraham got visited by 3 angels who told him stuff and then went and did things such as destroying a couple cities and rescuing nephew again. Nephew got rescued a lot. The year after that, Avraham had a son at the age of 100, which was and still is pretty nuts. My wife says I should probably specify that Sarah had the son and Avraham presumably just bought her water and changed diapers like all good dads should. Son's name was Yitzchak. He was a big deal. About 150 years after that, Yitzchak's son Yaakov fought an angel on this same date and got an ouchie. Hashem healed the ouchie, but to this day we don't eat that ouchie spot in animals. It's called the Gid Hanasha. On this day in 1314, a fellow named Moshe saw a bush that was on fire, and upon closer inspection, he saw that it was actually God. One thing led to another. There was way too many frogs for a while, flaming ice fell from the sky, and other bad stuff happened to the bad guys. A year later on the same day, the bad guys let us go, mostly as a result of all the frogs and flaming ice and such, and hence the holiday we just spent 25 minutes and 28 seconds on. Much later on, Queen Vashti was executed by her husband, King Ahasuerus, who, in general, was not known to make super intelligent decisions. But this one ended up being a good one, though. Well, not for Vashti, I suppose, but for everyone else. Firstly, because Vashti was known to be a bit of a jerk, and also because it led to us not dying a bit later on. And finally, speaking of not dying, on this day in the year 372 BCE, the prophet Daniel was chucked into a big hole filled with lions. This is generally not considered good for your health. In fact, it is generally understood to be fatal, but miraculously, the lions ended up being pretty chill and didn't hurt Daniel. Maybe they were Canadian lions. All right, that's it for Jewish history. In the evening of the 15th of Nisan, we begin counting the Omer, which will continue for the next 49 days until the holiday of Shavuot. The Omer harkens back to the year of the Exodus when the Jewish people eagerly counted down the days until they would receive the Torah. It also references the Omer grain offering, which was brought yearly on this day. Until it was offered, all new grain that had grown that year was forbidden to be eaten. Each night, we'll say a special blessing and formally count the days and weeks of the Omer. If you forgot to count at night, you can count the following day without saying a blessing, but if you miss that as well, you count all the remaining days without a blessing. Head to Chabad.org/Omer, that's O-M-E-R, for a comprehensive list of resources and insights into that. Sunday night, as mentioned, we celebrate our second Seder with pretty much the same observances and traditions as the first, with a couple minor differences. And finally, Monday, the second day of Pesach, is another big day for Jewish history. First off, a very happy birthday to Levi, the son of Yaakov. If you're a Kohen or a Levi, that means he's your grandpa, so make sure to wish him a happy birthday. Also on this day in the year 1273 BCE, the mun, the godly bread from heaven that kept the Jews alive during their 40 years in the desert, finally ran out. After offering the very first Omer grain sacrifice, the Jews began eating regular bread for the first time in 40 years. Of course, that bread was matzah, being that it was in the middle of Passover. Also on this day in 357 BCE, we've got another event from the Purim story. Queen Esther appeared before King Ahasuerus uninvited, risking her life, but ultimately leading to the salvation of the Jewish people. Monday night, we conclude the first 2 days of Pesach with Havdalah, taking us into Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days, in the next episode. We recite Havdalah over a cup of wine, as we do at the close of every Shabbat and holiday, but we do not light the Havdalah candle, and in Chabad tradition, we skip the besamim, the fragrant spices, as well. And with that, looks like we're all done until next time. Unfortunately, we haven't got time for my usual snappy outro, so da-da-da-da-da-da, the week ahead. Your Jewish Week is produced by Chabad.org, written and recorded by me, Rabbi David Paul Thiel. Theme music by Levi Gloshak.